Now, on this special edition of Local 6 News, day one of the Casey Anthony trial, and the defense drops a bombshell.
Caylee Anthony died on June 16, 2008, when she drowned in her family's swimming pool.
And that was just the beginning of a series of astonishing announcements made to try and save Casey's life.
She cried and asked for her father's help. And it was shortly thereafter that George did help. Mr. Kronk is a morally bankrupt individual who actually took Caylee's body and hid her. And it all began when Casey was 8 years old and her father came into her room and began to touch her inappropriately.
Local 6 News at 5. The Casey Anthony trial begins right now.
And welcome back to continuing coverage live outside of the Orange County Courthouse. Day one of the Casey Anthony trial. It has been a day of bombshells. Things that our own analysts, Mark NeJame and Mark O'Mara, said would happen today. But to hear them live in the courtroom from Jose Baez's mouth was quite a different thing. Let's go ahead and bring in Mark NeJame and Mark O'Mara now. Mark, let's start with you. You sat here most of the day listening to this as it was coming out, and we knew that they were going to go after George Anthony. I don't know that we really understood the veracity at which they would do it within the opening statements and the pictures, the graphic pictures that they would try to portray for the jury.
They absolutely did. We knew they were going to have to go after him because they have to have an explanation for Casey's behavior. The only way they can explain away her lies is to almost make it pathological, saying that she had something in her history that caused her to lie for 30 days straight, and they picked her dad. Seemingly at least a good start, the only start they had. I thought he did fairly well in his opening, but I've got to say, the state was wonderful. Perfect move in putting George Anthony on the stand first to begin with, because knowing, I guess, what he was going to respond, it took all of the air out of the defense case. And I think that Baez had a great opportunity. He had to have an opportunity to truly attack George, again, the abuser of his client. And it just fell flat.
Well, and we also understand that we'll get to the sexual abuse in a moment, because George Anthony has completely denied that on the stand immediately after the opening statements by Jose Baez. But let's get back to the cause of Casey Anthony's death, or Caylee Anthony's death, according to the defense, that she drowned. And not only did she drown, that they say George Anthony was the one that found her.
Well, I think that the defense has blown this. I think that the bombshell that you've seen is that the cross-examination bombed. I think that the state portrayed her as a professional liar, and there was nothing here to refute that. The fact of the matter is, it was, in my opinion, a terrible cross-examination. There's been a long time to prepare this. Not going in there, cross-referencing previous statements and all that. It was terrible. They have bombed. That's the bombshell. I don't know how the defense could ever resuscitate this case from this point forward.
All right, let's go ahead and go back an hour, though. Before the actual testimony of George Anthony and the cross-examination by Jose Baez, he did put on what we all felt was a pretty strong performance in the courtroom, emotional at times, especially when talking about the drowning of Caylee Anthony. Let's start to listen to some of those opening statements from earlier this afternoon.
Caylee Anthony died on June 16, 2008, when she drowned in her family's swimming pool. You're going to hear that Caylee loved to swim, and Caylee could get out of the house very easily, and did so on that day.
That was when he was actually speaking to the fact that she did drown. It was the first thing that we had heard in the opening statements from Jose Baez. We were waiting to hear what they were going to say was the cause of death, something that we did not know up until this point. And again, according to Jose Baez. There was one other soundbite, though, that we do want to hear quickly, talking about how Casey said she found Caylee dead in the arms of her grandfather. Let's listen to that.
On June 16, 2008, after Caylee died, Casey did what she's been doing all her life, or for most of it, hiding her pain. Going into that dark corner and pretending that she does not live in the situation that she's living in. She went back to that deep, dark, ugly place called denial to pretend as if nothing was wrong.
Like a wedding picture.
All right. The beginning of several emotional statements by Jose Baez in the opening statements. Tony Pipitone is joining us now. He was there in the courtroom, in the front row, watching all of this unfold. Tony, this is our first reaction from you live on Local 6 from what you saw in there. Were you as shocked as we were in hearing the accusations made by Jose Baez in these opening statements?
I was shocked by how explicit it was. I mean, we knew that there were questions that they were raising in jury selection about sexual abuse. We know she has written in letters after she'd been in jail for some time that she felt her brother treated her inappropriately at a time and that she thought maybe her father had done the same. So I was surprised that it was explicit as it was. I was surprised that, Jose really took it. In fact, I can tell you that the Anthony's attorney told me he was really angry because he knew the state had shared with them the psychological evaluations that were done recently by the psychiatrist and psychologist, had shared that, or the information in it, with Mr. Lippman, the attorney for George and Cindy, and he was surprised at how explicit it was. He didn't think they were going to go this far. So to the degree that they did, yes, that they brought this up, what else do they have?
Well, it was impressive. I mean, Jose Baez, I think, impressed some of the people that thought he was over his head during the opening statements. Then the prosecution calls their first witness, and it's George Anthony. Were you ready for that?
I didn't know who the first witness was going to be, and when it was going to be George Anthony, I wondered, is he going to take the fifth? Is he going to admit to this? He spoke to the grand jury. He testified to the grand jury about this, so he'd better be careful.
Well, and the big question was going to be, is he in on it? If he takes the fifth, is it possible that all along he was going to try to save his daughter in this trial? That is clearly not what happened when he got up on the stand.
You could hear the air coming out of the balloon of the defense, I think. When he got up there and he was sympathetic, he was direct, he answered the questions honestly as he has done in the past. I think coming off of that defense narrative, for whatever it was, when George Anthony took the stand, a lot of it went out the window.
All right, let's listen to George Anthony denying all of the accusations against him.
Now, Mr. Anthony, I need to ask you some questions about something else. Have you ever sexually molested your daughter, Casey Anthony?
No, sir.
Have you ever committed any sexually inappropriate act with or in the presence of your daughter, Casey Anthony?
No, sir.
Were you present in your home when Kaylee Anthony died?
No, and when I heard that today, it hurt really bad. Because if I would have known something would have happened to Kaylee, we wouldn't be here today.
He said he would do everything he could to make sure that he tried to save his granddaughter. He seemed very believable. I mean, this is a grandfather who talked about knowing his granddaughter's favorite movies. He named them, and he did, he remembered what she was wearing the last day that he saw her. And it did seem that Baez was continuing to kind of pull at whatever he could, trying to catch him in a lie, and I don't know that he ever did it.
No, he didn't trip him up at all, and when he started to get into things that were beyond the scope of direct examination, it was like Law School 101 in there. You can't do that. We're sitting in the gallery going sustained. I mean, you can't go there. But George Anthony will be back. He will be recalled several times, the state has said. The defense can do it too. Different issues will come up, and they can try again. But you saw there the George Anthony we've seen for the last 2.5 years, a distraught grandfather who had no idea what happened to his granddaughter, and in the back of his head fears the worst.
Why quit? Jose Baez just stopped calling for questions, just saying, I reserve to bring this witness back, but he really did just quit right in the middle and say, okay, wait, it almost seemed like, hey, I'm over my head here.
The lack of preparation, the inexperience is glaring. The fact of the matter is you don't go in and do that kind of cross-examination. You don't go do any cross-examination without knowing what your witnesses are going to say, and every question you ask, you should know the answer to. And the fact that's law school 101. You do not ask a question on cross-examination unless you know how they're going to answer that. And you take your witness by the leash and you take them where you want to take them. None of that was going on. This was a pitiful cross-examination, and I think that is almost impossible for the state to, for the defense to recover from this.
And one of the most shocking images presented by the defense was the image of an actual sexual act. Jose Baez said it today, but then when he got into the cross-examination, he did not raise any of those scenarios, none of those situations. Mark, do you think he actually has that proof somewhere?
He better have, because now he's promised it in his opening. Now, I presume it's going to come from Casey, and now it has to come from Casey. But if you think about what happened in the direct examination, Jeff Ashton said, "Did you ever sexually abuse her?" No. That opens the door for every question the defense wants to ask about incidents of sexual abuse. So, when she was 8 years old, did you take her to the park on her way to school? Did you do this when she was 13? And the reference he made to her showing up at school. Ask that question. You have the person who's abused your client right in front of you.
Any defense strategy that you could see why they would hold that information or those questions, or was this when you needed to strike?
No, there's no reason not to have given a hard cross-examination if you were ready. The reality of it is all they've got is by putting her on the stand. She's a professional liar, and they're going to go ahead and use her statements, and that's all they've got.
Okay, I mentioned earlier, after watching the prosecution opening statements, I said they didn't mention Roy Kronk. They didn't mention the Roy Kronk debacle. Right. And we all sat here and said, why mention Roy Kronk? He doesn't seem to be relevant if they're going to talk about an accidental death. Well, they absolutely mentioned Roy Kronk. In fact, they say that he moved the body, that he's the one who moved Kaylee, and they're still raising a lot of questions about Roy Kronk.